Hello everyone. Welcome to Worchester Street. I hope you enjoy your stay. This week, we have a special guest on the channel, Dark Owl Stories. She's one of my favorite horror narrators on YouTube, and I'm extremely excited to show you our collaboration on this story. This story is broken up into two parts, so once you've watched part 1 on my channel, be sure to head over to her video to watch the rest. It's linked in the description. With that being said, let's get started. I've been working as a private investigator here in New Hampshire for a few years now, and I'm good at what I do. You might have an image in your head of a noir detective, but to be honest, I work with far more cheating spouses than I do backlit alleys. I was sitting in my cramped office one afternoon when a girl walked in. She introduced herself as Bethany. She had bright red hair, freckles, and looked to be around 14 years old. "What can I do for you, Bethany?" I asked, gesturing for her to take a seat. She sat down, gripping a small white envelope, as if she was afraid it would float away.
My brother Nick has been missing for a few days, and I'm worried about him.
She was young, but her eyes were hard and calculating. They swept around my office before returning to me. Something about her reminded me of my own little sister Jane when she was that age. "Missing person cases are handled by the police," I said. "Why don't you go to them? They'll investigate for free."
No!
She nearly shouted.
I can't!
"Why not?"
I just can't.
I set my hands on the desk, waiting. Most people hate silence and will fill it on their own. After a long moment's hesitation, she continued.
My brother and I are orphans. We spent 11 years in foster homes. My brother turned 18 last year and became my guardian. We left the foster homes and got our own apartment. If the police find out that he's missing, though...
She trailed off. "You go back to a foster home until they find him," I finished. "Don't you have anyone you trust? Any family friends?"
No.
She said, and shot to her feet. She passed the envelope across my desk.
I won't go back to those homes. And like I said, I have money to pay you.
I opened the envelope and saw an assortment of $1 and $5 bills. It couldn't have been more than $50 in total. I looked up at her and saw that she was fighting back tears. She was a small thing sitting in my armchair, scared and pitiful. A wave of protectiveness towards her swept over me, and I passed her back the envelope. "You don't have to pay until we find him," I said. Relief shone in her face. She accepted the money, stuffing it back into a pocket. It made me question whether she would have had enough to eat if I'd kept it. I spent the next few minutes going over where her brother might have gone. According to Bethany, Nick had been searching for any living relatives. The night he disappeared, he'd been heading for a promising address that he'd found. She didn't know exactly where, just that it was in Vermont. All I had to go on was their first names, their last name, and their dates of birth. Searching all the hospitals and censuses for their birth certificates would be a mammoth task. From there, finding an address from their parents' names would be another job entirely. For most people, it would take weeks or months to do all that. I'm not most people. I won't bore you with all the details. I'll just say that it took me the better part of an afternoon. I sent Bethany to the store with a $20 bill to bring back some coffee for me and Pop-Tarts for her. She returned, and just as the sun began to get low in the sky, I managed to find a birth certificate for her. "Your parents' names are Henry Ives and Juliet Ives," I said. She nodded.
I think I remember hearing that once.
Another quick search brought me to a property in Vermont. A property apparently still owned by the now deceased Juliet and Henry Ives. I tapped my screen. "I think I found a good place to search for your brother. Now, why don't you head home and let me check the place out? I'll be back tomorrow and let you know what I find." Bethany shook her head.
I'm coming with you.
I sighed. "Bethany, didn't anyone tell you not to trust strangers?" Her eyes hardened again.
I had to live with strangers every day for 11 years. Don't lecture me about strangers.
I raised my hands in apology. She shook her head and continued.
Anyway, if you don't take me, you don't get the money.
I sighed, not bothering to tell her that $50 wouldn't even begin to cover my normal fees. Fine, I said. To be honest, I was thinking that she'd be the only person who'd be able to identify Nick's body. People rarely disappear. Most of the time when they do, it means they've been in a car accident. I more than half expected this excursion to end at a local morgue with Bethany identifying Nick's body. I shook the thought from my head. Who knew what we'd find? We loaded up into my car and set off up I-89. The sun set and a full moon rose, coating the landscape with a pale white light. The drive took us deep into a forested area. Soon, the road turned bumpy, but after another few minutes of driving, we were there. The house was massive and clearly abandoned. The entire area was lit up with moonlight. The entire building oozed a feeling of unease. The corners of my mouth twisted as I watched the gnarled trees surrounding the building. Something about it made me feel sick to my stomach. Bethany gasped. I whirled around, bringing up a flashlight, half expecting to see something between the trees. Instead, I saw a motorcycle leaning against a tree beside the road.
That's Nick's motorcycle.
Bethany said, her voice excited.
He's got to be here.
Or was here at least, I said. I didn't know what to make of it. Had Nick been spending a few days and nights here in this abandoned house? I tossed Bethany my flashlight and told her to stay behind me. We made our way up the mossy steps. I tried the doorknob, and to my surprise, it opened easily. I stepped inside, the entryway lit up by the moonlight that streamed through the large upper windows. I lit my phone's flashlight to provide some additional light. "Nick," I shouted into the house. "I'm here with your sister Bethany. Are you here?" There was no response. I took a few cautious steps into the house. The outside was clearly abandoned, but the inside looked pristine. I rubbed my finger across the mantel in the living room and felt no dust. I picked up the single picture frame that sat there, shining my light into it. A man and a woman with bright red hair smiled back at me. They were clearly siblings. Both of them were the spitting image of Bethany. I handed the picture frame to her and continued into the house. "Nick," I shouted again. I took a picture of the living room on my phone. Bethany passed me, taking a few steps towards the hallway.
Nick!
She shouted, her voice shrill. She turned to me, her face thoughtful.
This place looks familiar to me.
Then, a deep, wet, slithering voice came echoing from down the hallway.
"Miss Bethany, it's so good to see you again. Though seeing Master Nick was also so unexpected."
He spoke with a strange formality. It sounded like a butler from the 1920s. A faint dripping sound came from the darkness. I reached forward and pulled Bethany back behind me, still holding my phone in one hand. A dark silhouette appeared in the hallway, limping as it made its way towards us. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice catching in my throat. Some part of my mind was screaming at me to run, telling me that "who are you" was the wrong question, telling me that "what are you" might have been better.
"What have you forgotten, Bethany? We've served House Johnson for generations, given counsel and, when necessary, correction."
As he spoke, water dribbled from his mouth and spattered against the carpet as though he were salivating. He took one last step forward, stepping into the moonlight that was still streaming through the upper windows. He wore an old-fashioned butler suit, but his nose, mouth, and throat all looked as if they'd been torn away by rats. The top of his head was bald, pale, and shone like a lamp in the moonlight. Each of his fingers were long and spindled, resembling tree roots or octopus tentacles more than human fingers. I squeezed the camera on my phone, taking this picture. This thing smiled and leaned forward, shambling towards us again. I spun, threw Bethany over my shoulder, and sprinted for the door. The dripping, slithering sound grew louder and louder in my ears as I raced for the door. I slammed the door shut behind us and almost fell as I made my way down the mossy steps, still carrying Bethany. I reached the car, tossed her inside, and turned the engine over. When I looked up at the house, I saw that the door was wide open. I threw the car into drive, reverse, and drive again as I spun the car around. We shot down the dark, bumpy road as fast as I could without losing control. We spent a long moment not speaking, but Bethany began sobbing quietly where she sat. I looked over and saw she was still holding the photo I'd taken from the mantle. I just let her cry for a little bit while I drove back to the city. When she'd finally stopped, I cleared my throat. "Listen," I said. "My sister Jane has a house nearby. Why don't I drop you off there for the night? I don't think it's a good idea for you to be alone right now." She nodded. I called my sister and made the arrangements, and soon we were there. Jane came out and helped her into the house, talking of watching a movie together. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. I looked over at the seat where she'd been sitting and picked up the picture frame. I undid the back and pulled the picture out, examining the back of the photo. There was a small message written there. "Juliet and Brad, December 2003. Brad. He must be Bethany's uncle. Maybe he's still alive. I went home and fell asleep, thinking of ways I might be able to contact him. The next morning, I did some more digging. I discovered that the man in the photo was Bethany's mom's brother, named Brad Johnson. He worked at a huge law firm in downtown Manchester. I swung by my sister Jane's place the next morning to talk with Bethany. I sat down on a stool in Jane's kitchen and rubbed my face with my hands. "Hey, kiddo," I said. "Sleep okay?"
What do you think?
She asked. I blew air out and nodded. "Yeah, I figured as much. Listen, I found out where your uncle works, and I'm gonna go talk with him today. You want to come along?"
My uncle?
She spoke as if the words were unfamiliar in her mouth.
He's alive?
"Yeah, and apparently he's a big shot lawyer, too." Bethany nodded.
Let's go.
We loaded up in my car and set off for Manchester. After a short drive, we reached a large office building and made our way inside. The receptionist straightened when she saw us. "How can I help you two?" she asked. "I have a meeting scheduled with Brad," I lied. "He told me that you direct us to his office." She raised her eyebrows. I wasn't aware he was seeing any clients today, but of course, go on in. His door is the last one on the left. I thanked her and made my way down the hallway, Bethany following close behind. I gave a quick rap on his door and stepped inside. The walls of his office were plastered with pictures of local politicians and celebrities. Brad was apparently a man of the people. He had also aged considerably since the picture had been taken. He was fatter and more wrinkled, but a shock of bright red hair had remained. "Mr. Johnson," I said, "I was hoping to ask you a few questions." Who are you?" he sputtered, pushing back in his chair. "My name's Kian," I said. He looked confused until his eyes fell on Bethany, where she stood peeking from behind my legs. Then they widened with realization and horror. You're Juliet's daughter," he stammered. "It's like I'm looking in a mirror." He cut himself off, and his face hardened. "Get out, both of you, now." "Listen," I said. "Her brother Nick, your nephew, is missing. He went to their house in Vermont, and now we can't find him. We just need to know a little bit more about your family."
Uncle Brad, please. We just want to know how to get him back,
Bethany said, taking a few cautious steps towards him. Brad Johnson got to his feet, walked around the desk, and bent down so his face was a few inches from Bethany's. "Piss off," he said, spittle flying from his mouth. I leapt forward, grabbing his collar and pushing him back over the desk. Pens scattered across the surface, and his feet scrabbled for purchase on the ground, but I pressed his bulk over his large mahogany desk. His eyes jerked around wildly, and his hands scrabbled at mine. Then I let go. He fell back onto the desk and lay there, gasping and grabbing at his collar where I'd held him. It's time to go, Bethany, I said. We made our way out of the building and back to my car. I turned to her where she sat in the passenger seat. She was staring out the window at the clouds drifting by. Sorry about that, I said. Bethany didn't pull her eyes away from the clouds.
I guess we know why he never tried reaching out to us.
Listen, I'm gonna drive you back to your place to grab your stuff, and then back onto Jane's house for now. I have to make a few calls.
Okay.
I dropped her off, then spent the rest of the afternoon calling in a few favors, asking everyone in my fairly extensive network about Brad. I knew some people that knew some people, enough to gather that he had political aspirations. Apparently, he hoped to run for Senate in the following election. When a fellow investigator told me he'd been hired by Brad's wife to investigate an affair, I knew I'd lucked out. It was far more than I needed. I headed back to Manchester. These lawyer types always work late. The office building where Brad worked was connected to a car park. It was easy enough to check which car was registered to him. It was easier still to pick the lock and crawl into the back seat. I lay there in the darkness, waiting for him to get back to his car. After nearly an hour of waiting in the darkness, the car chirped and the doors unlocked. He opened the door and slipped into the seat with a heavy thump. That's when I straightened and pressed a knife against the back of his neck. "Evening, Mr. Johnson," I said. "Don't move." He stiffened and turned his head towards me. "No, that's just fine the way you are," I said, keeping my voice measured. "Keep on looking forward, and your throat doesn't get turned inside out." "What do you want?" he hissed. "Tell me about your family, Mr. Johnson," I said. He somehow stiffened even further. "I have nothing to say." I passed him the manila envelope containing my dirt on him. "You probably have nothing to say about this either then, right?" He took it, and with trembling hands, leafed through the pages. I'd take you down with me. You have my word." "There's no need for it to come to that," I said. "Just answer a few simple questions, and you'll be back on your way home to Megan like nothing ever happened. Or was it Isabel?" He cursed loudly. "Ask your questions then," he said. "What did I see in your parents' house last night?" "What did I see in that house last night?" Brad dropped his head and paused for a moment before answering under his breath. "The servants. You're gonna have to do better than that. I don't expect you to understand or believe me," he said. "I don't care what you expect. Go on. House Johnson, we've commanded respect and power for generations. And it's because of the servants." His words matched what I'd heard from the creature the night before. "Go on," I repeated. He remained silent. I reached forward and slapped the side of his head. He cringed away from the blow. "You won't believe me. I wouldn't believe me if I were you." "Whether or not I believe you is none of your concern. Keep talking." After another moment's hesitation, he began again, babbling fast enough that it was hard to catch all his words. The servants helped us for a price. Once per generation, the price had to be paid. If we didn't pay it, they said we'd regret it." "What was the price?" "One of the kids," he whispered. "Our parents sacrificed my sister Joanna to them." He spun around, his eyes flashing. "But when the servants passed to Juliet, she refused. She said she wouldn't give up one of her two precious brats, so she and her fool husband Henry tried to trick them, tried to trap them in a safe in the basement of that house. Next thing I know, they're both dead from dozens of stab wounds. If you want to know what I guess, it's that. Nick went down into the basement and opened the safe. Now get out of my car." I watched his eyes for a long moment. I've heard a lot of lies in my career, and despite the laughable tale he just told me, I believed him. I had seen these things, and I'd seen the police report that detailed Henry and Juliet Ives' injuries. I nodded to myself and pulled out a notepad. "There's just one more thing, Brad. I'm gonna need a written apology to Bethany for your actions this afternoon. I'll be out of here once I have that." He turned back forward. "I'm not gonna sign any I pressed the knife lightly against the back of his neck again. "That wasn't a request." He picked up the notepad and scrawled out a quick message. I grabbed it, read it over, and slipped out of the car. I made my way back to Jane's place and caught the last of dinner with her and Bethany. I watched Bethany as she ate her food and joked with my sister. The world wasn't fair, I decided as I drove home that night. The next morning, I sat Bethany down. I told her that I was going back to that house, and I was going to get her brother. I hope you all enjoyed this first part of the story. As I said in the beginning, part 2 is available now on Dark Owl Stories channel. Be sure to follow the link in the description to head over there and watch the rest of the story, and be sure to subscribe to her channel for her amazing narrations. As always, thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed my writing so far, you can check out my horror novella, The Journal Found at the South Pole, available now on Amazon. I also want to say thank you to my current and previous Patreon backers, Lilith Scyther, Melissa Priolo, Private Castle, Ricky Griffin, Anne McCrackers, Maureen Garcia, and Scott Terrier. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed your time on Worchester Street.